Hi, everyone. Welcome to Sandy Frank's political podcast for a people's revolution against the corporate fascist state. I'm your host, Sandy Frank. Today, we're going to be talking about a lot of things, but mainly, we're going to be continuing our discussion on United States foreign policy and the organization of our anti-war movement against the corporate fascists, using everything in their power to, not just to not have any information in the mainstream media about the not the increase of the violence committed by the United States in Middle Eastern nations and everywhere else. They do. The mainstream media does nothing but pretend like it's not even happening. And this has been going on for almost 2 decades. So we're gonna look at some recent events. We're gonna look at how the wars are increasing, not to take anything away from Barack Obama and George Bush, who are genocidist, warmongering, murderer of millions, neo-Nazis, which is what they are. But we're also going to be looking at how there's an increase in this new Trump era of the kill state. So we're going to start by looking at article from The Intercept by Glenn Greenwald. And then we're going to move on to some other things. And I apologize for not being on for a few days. I'm not sure how many days it's been, but yeah, just got caught up with a whole bunch of stuff going on, especially during the weekend, and I didn't have time to really do an episode. But that should not be the case for the coming time. But let's look at Glenn Greenwald's article from The Intercept from March 26th. Today is March 28th. Trump's war on terror has quickly become as barbaric and savage as he promised. From the start of his presidency, Donald Trump's war on terror has entailed the seemingly indiscriminate slaughter of innocent people in the name of killing terrorists. In other words, Trump has escalated the 16-year-old core premise of America's foreign policy that it has the right to bomb any country in the world where people it regards as terrorists are found, and in doing so, has fulfilled the warped campaign pledges he repeatedly expressed. The most recent atrocity was the killing of as many 200 Iraqi civilians from U.S. airstrikes this week in Mosul. That was preceded a few days earlier by the killing of dozens of Syrian civilians in Raqqa province when the U.S. targeted a school where people had taken refuge, which itself was preceded a week earlier by the U.S. destruction of a mosque near Aleppo that also killed dozens. And one of Trump's first military actions was what can only be described as a massacre carried out by Navy SEALs, in which 30 Yemenis were killed. Among the children killed was an 8-year-old American girl whose 16-year-old American brother was killed by a drone under Obama. Okay, so yeah, this is where we really left off this week. These two major events that he starts with: 200 killed in Iraq, and then dozens of Syrians killed a little bit earlier. These are the events we didn't. My last episode was before all those terrible things happened. So we're going to be going into more specifics of those events from Air Wars and the Free Thought Project and some others after this. Okay, to continue. In sum, although precise numbers are difficult to obtain, there seems little question that the number of civilians being killed by the U.S. in Iraq and Syria, already quite high under Obama, has increased precipitously during the first 2 months of the Trump administration. Data compiled by the site Air Wars tells the story. The number of civilians killed in Syria and Iraq began increasing in October under Obama, but has now skyrocketed in March under Trump. And they have a graph of coalition airstrikes in Iraq and Syria, alleged civilian deaths and levels of reporting, and it's a graph by month. And March compared to any other month is literally like a skyscraper compared to the other months. Go check out Air Wars for the kind of very it's the data gathering organization, really, and it just gives you a lot of the straightforward facts about everything. But continuing, what's particularly notable is that the number of airstrikes actually decreased in March, with a week left, even as civilian deaths rose, strongly suggesting that the U.S. military has become even more reckless about civilian deaths under Trump than it was under Obama. This escalation of bombing and civilian deaths, combined with the deployment of Trump of 500 ground troops into Syria beyond the troops Obama already deployed there, has received remarkably little media attention. This is in part due to the standard indifference in U.S. discourse to U.S. killing of civilians compared to the language used when its enemies kill people. Compare the very muted and euphemistic tones used to report on Trump's escalations in Iraq and Syria to the frequent invocation of genocide and war crimes to denounce Russian killing of Syrian civilians. And part of this lack of media attention is due to the Democrats' ongoing hunt for Russian infiltration of Washington, which leaves little room for other matters. But what is becoming clear is that Trump is attempting to liberate the U.S. military from the minimal constraints it observed in order to avoid massive civilian casualties. And this should surprise nobody. Trump explicitly and repeatedly vowed to do exactly this during the campaign. He constantly criticized Obama, who bombed 7 predominantly Muslim countries, for being weak in battling ISIS and Al-Qaeda. Trump regularly boasted that he would free the U.S. military from rules of engagement that he regarded as unduly hobbling them. He vowed to bring back torture and even to murder the family members of suspected terrorists, prompting patriotic commentators to naively insist that the U.S. military would refuse to follow his orders. Trump's war frenzy reached its rhetorical peak of derangement in December 2015, when he roared at a campaign rally that he would, quote, bomb the shit out of ISIS, and then let its oil fields be taken by Exxon, whose CEO is now the Secretary of State. Trump can be criticized for many things, but lack of clarity about his intended war on terror approach is not one of them. All along, Trump's, quote, solution to terrorism was as clear as it was simple, as I described it in September 2016. Glenn Greenwald has a tweet of what he said then. He said, Trump's anti-terror platform is explicitly 1, more bombing, 2, Israel-style police profiling, and 3, say radical Islam. And we continue. The clarity of Trump's intentions regarding the war on terror was often obfuscated by anti-Trump pundits due to a combination of confusion about the distortions of foreign policy doctrine. Trump explicitly ran as a, quote, non-interventionist, denouncing, for instance, U.S. regime change wars in Syria, Libya, and Iraq, even though he at some point expressed support for the first two. That's Iraq and Libya. Many commentators confused interventionism with pacifism, leading many of them to this very day to ignorantly claim that Trump's escalated war on terror bombing is in conflict with his advocacy of non-interventionism. It is not. To the extent that Trump is guided by any sort of coherent ideological framework, he is rooted in the traditions of Charles Lindbergh, whose America First motto he took, and the free trade hating, anti-immigration, uber-nationalist Pat Buchanan, Both Lindbergh and Buchanan were non-interventionists. Lindbergh was one of the earliest and loudest opponents of U.S. involvement in World War II, while Buchanan was scathing throughout all of 2002 about the neocon plan to invade Iraq. Despite being vehemently non-interventionist, neither Lindbergh nor Buchanan were pacifists. Quite the contrary. Both believed that when the U.S. was genuinely threatened with the attack or attacked, it should use full and unrestrained force against its enemies. What they opposed was not military force in general, but rather interventions geared toward a goal other than self-defense, such as changing other countries' governments, protecting foreigners from tyranny or violence, or, quote, humanitarian wars. What the Lindbergh, Buchanan, and non-interventionism opposes is not war per se, but a specific type of war, namely those fought for reasons other than self-defense or direct U.S. interests, parentheses, as was true of regime change efforts in Iraq, Libya, and Syria. Lindbergh opposed U.S. involvement in World War II on the ground that it was designed to help only the British and the Jews, while Buchanan, on the eve of the Iraq invasion, attacked neocons who, quote, seek to ensnare our country in a series of wars that are not in America's interests, and who, quote, have alienated friends and allies all over the Islamic and Western world through their ignorance, hubris, and bellicosity. The anti-Semitism and white nationalistic tradition of Lindbergh, the ideological precursor to Buchanan and then Trump, does not oppose war. It opposes military interventions in the affairs of other countries for reasons other than self-defense, i.e. the risking of American lives and resources for the benefit of, quote, others. Each time Trump drops another bomb, various pundits and other assorted Trump opponents smugly posit that his doing so is inconsistent with his touted non-interventionism. This is just ignorance of what these terms mean. By escalating violence against civilians, Trump is, in fact, doing exactly what he promised to do, and exactly what those who described his foreign policy as non-interventionist predicted he would do, namely, limitlessly unleash the U.S. military when the claimed objective was the destruction of terrorists, while refusing to use the military for other ends, such as regime change or humanitarianism. If one were to reduce his mentality to a motto, it could be fight fewer wars and for narrower reasons, but be more barbaric and criminal in prosecuting the ones that are fought. Trump's campaign pledges regarding Syria, and now his actions there, illustrate the point very clearly. Trump never advocated a cessation of military force in Syria, as the above video demonstrates. He advocated the opposite, an escalation of military force in Syria and Iraq in the name of fighting ISIS and Al-Qaeda. Indeed, Trump's desire to cooperate with Russia in Syria was based on a desire to maximize the potency of bombing there, just as was true of Obama's attempt to forge a bombing partnership with Putin in Syria. What Trump opposed was the CIA's years-long policy of spending billions of dollars to arm anti-Assad rebels, a policy Hillary Clinton and her key advisors wanted to escalate, on the ground that the U.S. has no interest in removing Assad. That is the fundamental difference between non-interventionism and pacifism, that many pundits are either unaware of or are deliberately conflating in order to prove their own vindication about Trump's foreign policy. Nothing Trump has thus far done is remotely inconsistent with the non-interventionism he embraced during the campaign, unless one confuses non-interventionism with opposition to the use of military force. Trump's reckless killing of civilians in Iraq, Syria, and Yemen is many things: barbaric, immoral, and criminal. It is also ironically likely to strengthen the support for the very groups, ISIS and Al-Qaeda, that he claims he wants to defeat, given that nothing drives support for those groups like U.S. slaughter of civilians. Perhaps the only competitor in helping these groups is another Trump specialty, driving a wedge between Muslims and the West. But what Trump's actions are not is the departure from what Trump's actions are not is a departure from what he said he would do. Nor are the inconsistent nor are they inconsistent with the predictions of those who described his foreign policy approach as non-interventionist. To the contrary, the dark savagery guiding U.S. military conduct in that region is precisely what Trump expressly promised his supporters he would usher in. So, that's an article from Glenn Greenwald of The Intercept. Of course, when we're talking about the anti-war movement and we're talking about these different factions within the U.S. government and Western government and moneyed, wealthy governments, we're talking about a lot of different factions of warmongers. We want to, of course, know the differences between, say, the Hillary Clintons and the John McCains, as opposed to the Trumps and the Buchanans and the Lindberghs. These are, they have the same purpose in that they want to strengthen the war machine and do that by any way possible, is tricking a base into thinking we need to, we need to be arming rebels. It was what Clinton and McCain and the establishment want, as compared to what Trump wants, is to really rabble to his base and create, not any type of pacifism, but the targets where the Trump people deem as the places for these terrorist strikes. You do what Donald Trump campaigned on. You bomb the shit out of them. So we of course want to, as an anti-war movement that wants to be successful, we want to, of course, know key differences among different wealth factions and warmongering factions within our government who wish to kill more and more people. So now we're going to look at the Free Thought Project, an article by Matt Agorist. It's just really a report of, let's look. U.S. airstrikes slaughtered 230 innocent civilians in a single night in Mosul. Mosul, Iraq. Reports coming out of Iraq this week are downright terrifying, with local media reporting up to as many as 230 innocent civilians slaughtered in U.S. coalition strikes in a single night. According to the Kurdish media company Rudaw, 137 people, most believed to be civilians, died when a bomb hit a single building in Al-Jadida in the western side of the city on Thursday. Another 100 were killed nearby. As the British Telegraph reports, the casualties were, quote, mostly women and children, and were, quote, were pulled from 3 adjoining houses in the Jadida neighborhood of West Mosul overnight Wednesday and into Thursday morning, according to witnesses. Quote, there was so much bombing and so many deaths, an elderly woman said of the strikes. According to Anti-War, Central Command said that they were, quote, aware of the loss of life and were carrying out further investigation, while insisting that all of their strikes against Mosul overnight, quote, comply with the law of armed conflict. CENTCOM also reported that, quote, military force conducted 9 strikes consisting of 67 engagements coordinated with and in support of the government of Iraq against ISIS targets. Al Jazeera's Stephanie Decker, reporting from Erbil in North Iraq, said fighting in the area had intensified in the last few days. Quote, for more than a week there was a stalemate as Iraqi forces struggled to advance on the old city, but in the last few days the fighting has intensified. There are airstrikes and ISIL is also using civilian homes with civilians in them. People have been caught in crossfire and targeted by ISIL. The shelling is indiscriminate, said Decker. There is no safe passage out of the city. Civilians are literally everywhere. Reports from the civilians in Mosul say ISIS fighters are employing tactics such as establishing fighting positions on the rooftops of apartment buildings. These buildings are occupied by innocent civilians and are also the targets of U.S. coalition strikes. Quote, ISIS made us keep our door open so they could get onto the roofs at any time. They even broke down the walls between houses so they could move around, a local resident told RT. There were so many killed in the airstrikes, rockets, and mortars. Our entire neighborhood is in ruins. There are maybe 10 houses still standing. The children are traumatized. When the jets start flying, they start crying, another woman said. If the aim of ISIS is to maximize civilian casualties by manipulating the U.S. military into striking these targets, that they have done. If their aim was to reduce airstrikes, they have failed. However, if we examine the mission of ISIS more closely, the former is more likely. The mission of ISIS is to create a rift in society in which there are extremists and everyone else. They want to eliminate the gray zone, the area in which different religions and cultures peacefully coexist, by any means necessary, by using civilians. So we'll stop reading there because, when we talk about ISIS, we're talking about the United States military, and we're talking about staged terror events all over Iraq, all over Syria, all over these countries we're destroying. And as Glenn Greenwald said in the previous article, there are two great ways to create terrorism, and surely as for how fake and Western funded all of these terrorist groups are, there is recruitment of people in these countries who are angry at what the genocide of the Western imperialists, but that's what Glenn Greenwald said. He said you create terrorists by bombing their countries, murdering people's family and friends and all this. That's one way to create it. And then the second way to create it is really what Donald Trump and the InfoWars and old Breitbart does. It's Islamophobia, creating a rift between the West and Middle Eastern nations and Islam and all these things. And that's what the United States media specializes in, which is creating. It's first about not reporting on any of the murder, so people in the West wouldn't even know why people in Iraq and people in Syria and Libya feel as angry as they do, and why many of them support ISIS, which is true to a certain extent. Though ISIS is very much funded by our government, but it is clear that it's clear where terrorism comes from. The terrorism that does actually exist. It comes from imperialist bombing of countries and all this. The men, women, and children who watched their father, mother, son, or daughter explode right before their eyes this week as a U.S. bomb destroyed their home will undoubtedly foster resentment toward the West. This approach is the most powerful recruiting tool the terrorist regime has. As the Free Thought Project has previously reported, the West and their constant bombardment, interference, meddling, and policing of the world has fostered a breeding ground for terrorism. Indeed, America's foreign policy alone since 9/11 has created 1 million Osama bin Ladens, all funding and arming of ISIS excluded. Sadly, the military-industrial complex shows no signs of slowing its cancer-like growth. As long as Americans keep buying the lies spewing from the warmongering tyrants in power, nothing will change. As long as Bubis Americanus continues to believe, quote, it's our freedom they hate, death and destruction will rain down until there is nothing left. So, pretty good article from Matt Agorist. I don't know, there's kind of a trend among these kind of anti-war journalists here to kind of bury the lead of course, the lead being 230 people, mostly women and children, killed, but then to start talking about ISIS before you start talking about ISIS's boss who funds them, which is Western governments. So, but we're going to continue with the Free Thought Project. We're going to look at the massive protest that went on in Yemen. So from Claire Burnish of the Free Thought Project, hundreds of thousands gather in massive protest to U.S.-sponsored Saudi terrorism in Yemen. Sana'a, Yemen, hundreds of thousands took to the streets in the Yemeni capital of Sana'a to protest the second anniversary of the invasion by Saudi Arabia, as well as the ongoing military offensive by the loosely U.S.-backed Saudi-led coalition of 9 nations attempting to crush the Shia Houthi rebellion. Quote, I participated in the protests against the aggression by the Saudi-led coalition. Maybe our voice will be heard by the world over to stop the war. The Associated Press quoted protester Ahmed Moshen, who along with war-weary throngs of others participated to try to call attention to the U.S.'s other major conflict. Quote, 2 years of wanton violence and bloodshed, thousands of deaths, and millions of people desperate for their basic rights to food, water, health, and security, railed UN High Commissioner for Human Rights Zayed Ra'ad al-Hussein. Enough is enough. Although official crowd totals have not been confirmed, immense crowds clogged the capital's city streets as supportive and direct actions by the U.S. military ratcheted up significantly in recent weeks under the nascent Trump administration. Quote, casualty figures have exceeded 10,200 since the beginning of the conflict, with a reported 40,000 injured and more than 3 million displaced, admitted state-run RT reports. Quote, over the past month alone, 106 civilians have been killed in Saudi-led airstrikes, the UN said in a press release. According to the Associated Press, the protest, quote, organized by Shiite Houthi rebels supporting former President Ali Abdullah Saleh and Houthi leader Abdul Malik al-Houthi, called for an end to the conflict, which has killed more than 10,000 civilians, displaced over 3 million, and pushed the impoverished country to the brink of famine. A mosaic of extenuating circumstances and delicate political dealings came as baggage with the Saudi invasion of the geostrategically invaluable nation located at one mouth of the world's most heavily traveled maritime commerce route. In fact, to choke remaining resistance to the internationally recognized government of Abed Rabo Mansour Hadi, the U.S.-supported coalition has imposed a supply blockade to insufferable consequences, the likes of which should constitute a war crime: starvation. Despite no official declaration of war and continuous headlines from the simultaneous Syrian conflict, the situation in Yemen has mushroomed into an horrific humanitarian crisis. Quote, everywhere you go, you see people begging in the streets in bigger numbers. You see people rummaging through rubbish to survive, admonished Jamie McGoldrick, UN humanitarian coordinator for Yemen, cited by the BBC. Quote, you hear catastrophic stories of children dying because they can't get to health centers, people dying of malnutrition, people dying of preventable diseases. It will get worse because the problem is that the economy is in really bad shape and banking sector doesn't function. Just last month, the United Nations World Food Program reported on the scope of an issue for which the U.S. is inexcusably complicit, as ABC Australia reports. Yemen is the worst Oh, sorry. Let me look here. Quote, Yemen is the worst affected country, with the UN describing it as being on the brink of famine. More than 7.3 million people urgently need food assistance, and more than 460,000 children are suffering from severe acute malnutrition. As The Intercept's Alex Emmons explains, quote, last week the UN warned that the majority of Yemen's population is suffering and on the brink of famine. Stephen O'Brien, the UN's Undersecretary General for Humanitarian Affairs, criticized both sides of the conflict for restricting the flow of aid, but said that the Saudi-imposed naval blockade was particularly devastating for the desert country, which imports most of its food. Quote, the Saudi-led coalition has persistently attacked fishermen who account for another major food resource in Yemen. Quote, the situation has worsened as the Saudi-backed forces prepare to retake the western port of Hodeida, once the waypoint of 70% of Yemen's food and air and aid imports. Near the beginning of the war, Saudi Arabia bombed the cranes that port workers used to unload ships, slowing the pace of work to a crawl. Since then, airstrikes by the coalition have made it virtually impossible for aid to reach the port. For the U.S., Yemen serves as the driver of an escalating proxy war with Iran, as Houthi rebels, long rumored to be receiving clandestine but expansive assistance from Tehran, received official support in the form of weapons, arms, finance, logistics from the Iranians to starve off the Saudi coalition. Reuters reports an unnamed and unverified senior Iranian official claimed Major General Qasem Soleimani of the Quds force allegedly held meeting last month seeking means to bolster the Houthi rebellion. Quote, as at this meeting they agreed to increase the amount of help through trading arms and financial support, the anonymous official said. Quote, Yemen is where the real proxy war is going on, and winning the battle in Yemen will help define the balance of power in the Middle East. With stakes that critical to multiple parties in the conflict, it seems Yemen could become the U.S. next nightmarish mirage, on par with Afghanistan and Iraq. No matter how many hundreds of thousands, if not millions, express consternation to war as they gather in the streets of their homeland. So we see massive protest to what is going on in these ravaged countries. And the term is proxy war. The term is the U.S. is funding Saudi Arabia, in this case against Yemen, to make the need for not only a conflict with Yemen, but also a conflict with other countries that we don't yet have our bombs dropping in, namely Iran, which is where we're heading next. So, we see people globally going into the streets and protesting this. So now let's look at this article from The Intercept. I'm just looking at this from Zaid Jalani. This is more of a domestic more look at the anti-Muslim movement within the United States. The title of the article is Former Democratic Senators Advised Group Funding Anti-Muslim Extremist Frank Gaffney. So let's just read a little bit of this article and then we're going to move on to some other stuff. America's powerful pro-Israel lobbying group, the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, enlisted the help of one of the nation's most prominent and extreme anti-Muslim activists, Frank Gaffney, during its 2015 push to sink the Iran nuclear deal, and it did so through an organization staffed by some of the country's most prominent Democratic consultants and advised by a group of 4 ex-Senate Democrats. AIPAC's funding of Gaffney was uncovered earlier this month by Loblog's Eli Clifton. He noticed that a 501c4 dark money organization called Citizens for a Nuclear Free Iran, or CNFI, which AIPAC created to oppose the Iran deal, gave $60,000 to, quote, Secure Freedom, a group whose tax ID number identifies it as belonging to Gaffney's think tank, the Center for Security Policy, or CSP. AIPAC later confirmed to Haaretz that it offered the funding to Gaffney to run ads opposed to the Iran deal. Gaffney and the CSP are notorious in Washington for circulating some of America's most wild anti-Muslim conspiracy theories, such as that Hillary Clinton aide Huma Abedin is a covert operative of the Muslim Brotherhood. Nonsense. An accusation so bizarre that even the then Republican Speaker of the House, John Boehner, condemned it in 2012. Gaffney has also claimed that Barack Obama should be, quote, considered America's first Muslim president, and that Obama made commitments to promote Islam in America. Warmonger Barack Obama. This is the height of controlled opposition. So you might assume, given the CNFI were willing to partner with such a far-right fringe organization, that it would be staffed by hardcore conservative Republicans. But you would be wrong. In fact, during its failed campaign to sink diplomacy with Iran, CFNI enlisted a gamut of the top Democrats. Its advisory board, including 4 Democratic senators turned lobbyists, Mark Begich of Alaska, Joe Lieberman of Connecticut, Evan Bay of Indiana, and Louisiana's Mary Lindrow. Former Nevada Democratic Congressman Shelley Berkeley also advised the group. None of the former lawmakers who advised CNFI replied to requests for comment about the group's financial support for Gaffney. In addition to Gaffney's accusations about Abedin, he has claimed that officials in the U.S. government are waging a, quote, civilizational jihad to undermine the country from within. Gaffney was even briefly banned from the Conservative Political Action Conference after he accused anti-tax activist Grover Norquist of being part of a purported plot to bring Islamic law to America. His sham polling was also used by then-candidate Donald Trump to justify his call for a total ban on Muslim migration to the United States. In addition to the former members of Congress and political firms like Trilogy Interactive and Winning Connections, CNFI deployed a number of top Democratic consultants and pollsters to run its campaign. Mark Putnam cut his teeth working for a long list of Democratic candidates, but his most prominent work was producing television advertising for both of Barack Obama's presidential campaigns. His firm, Putnam Partners, was hired by CNFI to produce television ads designed to frighten Americans about the consequences of the Iran nuclear deal. Shortly after his hiring by CNFI, Putnam spoke to the Washington Post to explain his convictions in opposing diplomacy by the president he had worked for. Quote, I am more grateful to President Obama than I can ever express for being able to help him in 2 presidential campaigns, he told the Post. Quote, I have strongly supported every other initiative he has undertaken. On this issue, however, I, like other Democrats, have a heartfelt position against the agreement. So, we'll continue with it, but as George Carlin said, it's a big club and you ain't in it, you know. It's a big club and, the people, they put on this little game for you, but the people who are anti-Muslim are also the people getting Barack Obama elected, and Barack Obama is, of course, anti-Muslim, but he's used by these anti-Muslim people to get support for the anti-Muslim people by saying Barack Obama's the enemy. They're all working together. It's all symbiotic. It's all part of a plan. Newly released disclosures showed that Putnam's firm was paid $162,000 for his heartfelt work in 2015. He did not respond to a request for comment from The Intercept. Patrick Dorton served as a spokesman for the CNFI during his anti-Iran deal campaign. Today, he is a partner at the firm Rational 360, but in the past, he worked for a number of top Democrats, including former President Bill Clinton, former Senator Tom Harkin, and current Oregon Congressman Peter DeFazio. Thornton also did not respond to a request for a comment from The Intercept. Mark S. Mellman of the Mellman Group was hired to commission polling for CFNI. Mellman is a veteran Democratic pollster. On his biography webpage, he boasts of working for the campaigns of 29 U.S. senators, 10 governors, and many other officials. One of his top clients was former Democratic Senate leader Harry Reid. Mellman told The Intercept that he has no affinity for Gaffney's ideology, but declined to condemn AIPAC or CNFI for financially supporting him, claiming ignorance of the relationship. Quote, "I'm someone who got money, not someone who gave money," he told me, laughing. Mellman's firm was paid $241,000 by the CNFI. Quote, "It's not my organization. I was paid by that organization to do work for them," which I did. I didn't know who else was paid by that organization. Quote, "Do you have any personal regrets about being associated with an organization that would also be supporting Frank Gaffney?" I followed up. Mellman paused for a moment, then responded with a joke. Quote, "How often do you beat your wife?" After being asked again if it were appropriate for AIPAC to support Gaffney, Mellman started to raise doubts about the story altogether. Quote, "I don't know anything about it other than what you're telling me, based on documents that you've seen that I haven't," he said of the CNFI's grant to Gaffney's group. I offered to send him the disclosure forms so he could review them, but he declined. Quote, "I really don't feel like paying an accountant to review the documents," he said. "The disclosure forms are right here, and you don't have to be an accountant to read them. The grant to Gaffney is on page 13." So he adds the proof of this person being paid off. So again, folks, it's a big club, and you ain't in it. They all work together. They're all working together for the same goals, which is for them to stay rich, and for innocent people in Middle Eastern nations and everywhere to die, to be bombed, and to be killed. Let's look at one more article about foreign policy. U.S. General, 5,000 more troops needed for Afghanistan. It's been reported for over a month that General John Nicholson, the commander of U.S. and NATO forces in Afghanistan, wants more troops for the 16-year war. Over the weekend, however, he offered more details about the size he envisions for the new force. General Nicholson now says he wants another 5,000 U.S. and NATO troops, saying he believes the U.S. needs that many to, quote, break the stalemate in the war. Nicholson has reportedly labeled the conflict a stalemate in recent weeks, which appears to be an overestimation of the situation, with the Taliban continuing to gain ground against Afghan security forces. The U.S. has repeatedly run into this problem in Afghanistan, with the government's force unable to stand up to the Taliban by themselves, and NATO growing weary of continuing to prop them up. This has led to escalations and de-escalations for years, constantly trying to save the Afghan government from outright defeat. Nicholson argues that because 9/11 involved Afghanistan, a loss in the country would embolden terrorists globally. At the same time, throwing in addition 5,000 U.S. and NATO troops, which would likely end up being almost exclusively U.S. troops at the war 16 years later, doesn't seem like it's going to resolve the conflict, but rather just extend it once again. That's from antiwar.com, Jason Ditz. And again, a short article, but obviously about the fact that exactly what Glenn Greenwald said, what we looked at. You create more terrorism by bombing people and by funding things like AIPAC, and Donald Trump type of rhetoric. Bombing people, creating an imaginary rift between Islam, and lying about Islam and creating Islamophobia. That's how you create terrorism. And believe me, Barack Obama and Donald Trump know this, and it's their fucking goal. So we need to organize an anti-war movement, go out in the streets by the hundreds of thousands, by the millions, and not just protest, work in a strategic way to stop this from happening any way possible. I'm talking about bringing bombs to U.S. military bases and fucking killing police officers is what I'm talking about a revolution in the style of Cuba. So we'll continue our discussion on that. And also check out my other videos for. I've talked about anti-war movements a lot. Go look through my YouTube channel. But now to end, we're gonna look at again Caitlin Johnstone of Newslog. We're gonna look at the continuing Russia propaganda nonsense, and we're gonna first look at what she put out today. The title of the article is Dick Cheney says there's no doubt that Russia has weapons of mass destruction. Hacked the election. Funny. Today, in a speech at the Economic Times Global Business Summit, former Vice President Dick Cheney has said in no uncertain terms that Saddam Hussein definitely has weapons of mass destruction. The Russia definitely hacked the election. Citing a, quote, rising number of threats in the world, Cheney asserted that there is, quote, no question that Vladimir Putin, has 600 metric tons of chemical weapons that are still uncounted. Ordered a hacking campaign to tilt the 2016 election in favor of Donald Trump. Calling this behavior an act of war, Cheney went on to accuse Putin, of plotting a 9/11 style attack on America. Of having designs on Baltic states. Gosh, this is hard. I keep mixing these two stories up for some reason. It's a confusing mess combing through these news stories about Dick Cheney's hawkish rhetoric. Look at the quote from him on August 2002. Quote, simply stated, there is no doubt that Saddam Hussein now has weapons of mass destruction. There is no doubt he is amassing them to use against our friends, against our allies, and against us. Now look at this one from today. Quote, there's no question that there was a very serious effort made by Mr. Putin and his government, his organization, to interfere in major ways with our basic fundamental democratic processes. Can you blame me for getting mixed up? It's almost like he's saying and doing the same exact kind of thing 15 years apart. Again, here's 2002 Cheney, quote, in the days of the Cold War, we were able to manage the threat with strategies of deterrence and containment. But it's a lot tougher to deter enemies who have no country to defend. And containment is not possible when dictators obtain weapons of mass destruction and are prepared to share them with terrorists who intend to inflict catastrophic casualties on the United States. And here's 2017 Dick Cheney. Quote, another aspect of Mr. Putin's conduct is the issue that is now very much in the headlines at home. And that has to do with the cyber attack on the United States. The fact that he took his capabilities in the cyber area and used it to influence our election. This is who you've allied yourself with, Democrats. This is where you've decided to take your stand. With war criminals like Dick Cheney, who should have stood trial at The Hague many years ago. With John McCain, who has supported every single evil act of American military interventionism in his entire lifetime, and who has pushed for many, many other acts of warfare that our world was fortunate enough to avoid. I look in liberal discussion circles and I see these bloodthirsty war criminals being celebrated as heroes for standing up to Donald Trump, as though they oppose his vile human rights policies, when really they only oppose his resistance to the neocon policy of regime change invasion. Nobody has pushed for the deaths of hundreds of thousands of innocent civilians in Muslim countries actually cares about the immigrant bans in those same countries. Come on. What have you become, Democrats? How did you get here? I think it's worth taking a few steps back to reassess your situation. I'm not addressing the career politicians on Capitol Hill here. We all know they're crooks. I'm addressing the real and rank and file members of the Democratic Party. What happened to you? I've been watching you my whole life, and I can honestly say I've never seen you so crazy. You used to care about the poor, the working class, economic justice, taking care of everyone, but now, whenever I look in your direction, I get blasted in the face with McCarthyist vitriol and George W. Bush prancing around on the Ellen Show, while you all cheer and talk about how you wish you could be president again instead of Trump. This is madness, Democrats. This is not who you are. You know this. Please follow your hearts back to sanity. Thank you. So, again, with the anti-war discussion, when your resistance against Trump it contains Dick Cheney and George W. Bush, you don't have much of a resistance to an anti-war movement or anything for that matter. You've completely given you've completely given up any type of actual resistance because you worship bullshit. So continuing with Caitlin Johnstone, we're looking at another article from hers from a few days ago. Serious question: is Russian propaganda really worse than deep state propaganda? It has become abundantly clear that the American public will never be shown any tangible proof of Russian hackers passing the emails of Democratic Party officials to WikiLeaks, either directly or throughout intermediaries. If this was going to happen, it would have happened by now. But instead, all we're getting are more and more reasons to disbelieve the, quote, Russian hacked the election narrative. The CrowdStrike report so many establishment outlets have been citing as evidence of Russian tampering has recently been severely undermined by accusations from the Ukrainian military and an influential British think tank that another alleged Russian hacking attack cited in the report to substantiate their claims never actually happened. And earlier this month, we learned from WikiLeaks that the CIA was cultivating the ability to forge signs of Russian cyber intrusions prior to the hacking allegations. To compensate for the crumbling narrative, America's unelected power establishment, known as the deep state, has been increasingly emphasizing Russian propaganda in their reports, and have largely switched from the phrase election hacking to election meddling to better reflect this shift in emphasis. Headlines are now full of blurbs about information warfare, Russian bots and online Kremlin operatives saturating social media with articles from RT and Sputnik to try and sway public opinion before the election, with mainstream publications even going so far as to suggest the alt-right outlets like InfoWars and Breitbart may be likely guilty of treason, accusing those outlets of coordinating the spread of their pro-Trump articles with the Russian government. The notion of RT and Sputnik trying to gain maximum visibility in American audiences prior to the election is a lot more credible than the Russians' hacking allegations. So the new official narrative does have that going for it, but it comes with a gaping plot hole of its own. All reasonably well-informed Americans are aware that they are being propagandized constantly by their own government. Noam Chomsky has been speaking for decades about the way the corporate media is used by America's corporatist power structures to manufacture the consent of the governed by propagandizing the public with a deceitful narrative that convinces them that their rulers are acting in their best interest despite all evidence to the contrary. In 2013, the U.S. government officially gave itself the right to use PSYOPs on its own citizens, protecting itself from any possible legal repercussions of the practices they've been employing for generations. We'll go through this article pretty quick. Is any of this less informative than the Russian government trying to manipulate your opinions? From the following options, what would you prefer? A, for the Russian government to conduct PSYOPs on you. B, for the American power establishment to conduct PSYOPs on you. C, for the government to stay the fuck out of your fucking mind and leave you the fuck and your countrymen the fuck alone. Did you ever consent to any of this? Do you remember signing up to live in a country full of brainwashed zombies whose psyches are constantly pummeled into consenting to the exploitation of the Walmart economy and the evils of the military-industrial complex? Did you elect any of the corporatist propagandists constantly babbling about Russian propaganda on your TV screen? Is it not the most obnoxious thing in the world with these people are trying to paint Russia's manipulation as an act of war, while they themselves are currently trying to sink their rapey fingers as deep into your minds as possible? It's almost too much hypocrisy to think about. It's recursive hypocrisy. It's fractal hypocrisy. Hypocrisy on top of hypocrisy on top of hypocrisy, all the way down and all the way, all for the purpose of manipulating people into consenting to their own abuse and exploitation. These people are actually talking about your mind as though it is their property to manipulate as they please in a totally monogamous, abusive relationship. It actually hurts my brain just thinking about it. I'm gonna go lie down. Contrary to the propaganda that corporate media has been trying to institutionalize as America's unelected power structures become more and more obvious, the deep state is not some wild conspiracy theory, but only a concept used in political analysis to illustrate the self-evident fact that there are unelected people in power in America, and that people in power tend to form alliances. These alliances form the structure that the current administration is locked in a power struggle with, and it's good that more attention is being brought to it. Fight the deep state. Fight deep state propaganda. All of this political talk is for nothing until the elected manipulators behind the unelected manipulators behind the elected government are neutered and uprooted, including their propaganda mouthpieces in the corporate media. Keep speaking the truth. Keep fighting their lies. Okay, so we're going to leave it there, and she kind of did a good sign off for me there. We need to organize, especially an anti-war movement. Please like and subscribe and comment on this video and do whatever to it. I am Sandy Frank, and I will see you in the next one.